Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce encountered a deeply troubling incident outside a Kansas City apartment building when they witnessed police officers harassing an elderly veteran during what appeared to be a routine identification check. But the disrespect that unfolded and Travis's immediate response would thrust veteran rights into the spotlight in ways no one anticipated. During a peaceful Sunday afternoon in Kansas City, Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce were traveling to visit one of Travis's former teammates who resided in a humble apartment complex located on the east side of town. Marcus had extended an invitation for a casual barbecue, and they were eagerly anticipating a relaxed day with friends away from constant media attention. Taylor commented on her appreciation for Marcus's neighborhood choice as Travis parked their vehicle in the designated visitor parking area, expressing how the area felt genuinely normal and community-focused while observing numerous families outside enjoying the pleasant weather conditions. The apartment complex buzzed with typical Sunday afternoon activities as children played energetically in the courtyard area, families operated grills on their individual balconies, and elderly residents occupied benches throughout the property while soaking up the warm spring sunshine. Marcus had specifically mentioned his desire to live somewhere that maintained authentic community feelings. Travis explained while collecting the dessert Taylor had prepared for the barbecue gathering, noting that Marcus had grown up in similar neighborhoods and wanted to preserve that connection to his roots. As they walked through the complex toward Marcus's building, they could hear distinct sounds of families enjoying their weekend time together, including music playing from various units, children laughing throughout the courtyard, and the general buzz of a close-knit community spending quality time together. However, as they rounded the corner approaching Building C, the entire atmosphere shifted dramatically and concerning. Two uniformed police officers had detained an elderly man positioned near the entrance to one of the residential buildings. The man appeared to be in his late 60s with distinguished gray hair and a slight stoop that suggested many years of demanding physical labor. He was dressed in clean but obviously worn clothing consisting of khaki pants and a button-down shirt, and he was carrying a small bag containing groceries from a recent shopping trip. One of the officers was demanding to see some form of identification as Travis and Taylor moved within hearing distance of the interaction, and the elderly man replied that he lived in the building and was simply returning from a grocery store visit. The second officer interjected with a more aggressive tone than his partner's approach, emphasizing that the man needed to produce identification immediately when a police officer made such a request. Taylor and Travis deliberately slowed their walking pace, as both sensed something fundamentally wrong about this particular interaction between the officers and the resident. The elderly man addressed the officers while reaching slowly into his back pocket, stating that he possessed his driver's license but needed to understand why they were stopping him since he hadn't committed any wrongdoing. The first officer claimed they had received a call regarding suspicious activity in the area, and that someone matching the man's description had been observed acting strangely near the residential buildings. Travis and Taylor exchanged meaningful looks because the someone matching your description explanation seemed vague at best, and the elderly man hardly appeared to be someone who would engage in any form of suspicious activity. The man explained that he had lived in the building for 10 years and that everyone in the community knew him personally, including Mrs. Patterson from apartment 2B, who had waved at him just 5 minutes earlier. The second officer instructed the man to calm down, stepping closer while claiming that his agitation was making the situation more difficult to resolve. Travis could observe that the man wasn't displaying aggressive agitation, but was becoming increasingly distressed, and something about his body language suggested he was experiencing some form of internal crisis or panic response. The man suddenly declared that he had fought for the country, his voice cracking with emotion, explaining that he had served 3 tours in Vietnam and shouldn't be required to prove his right to belong in his own neighborhood. Travis immediately noticed the man's hands beginning to shake noticeably and his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. And as someone who had gained knowledge about PTSD through his extensive work with veteran charities, Travis recognized the clear signs of someone experiencing a panic attack or trauma response. Travis approached the group and politely excused himself while suggesting that the gentleman might be experiencing a medical episode that required immediate attention. Both officers turned to examine Travis, and one of them immediately recognized his identity, with the first officer acknowledging Travis Kelce and asking what brought him to this particular neighborhood. Travis replied that he was visiting friends, but emphasized that his immediate concern focused on the elderly man who was now leaning against the building wall and clearly struggling with his breathing and composure. Travis asked the man directly if he was okay, and the man looked up with a mixture of confusion and gratitude, explaining that he couldn't breathe properly and that the uniforms reminded him of something he couldn't complete describing. Travis gently asked if he was a Vietnam veteran, and the man managed to identify himself as Frank Rodriguez from the 1st Infantry Division, who had served from 1968 to 1971. Subscribe now to learn how Travis's next discovery would expose months of systematic harassment that had been targeting Frank and other veterans in the community. Taylor had joined their group and could clearly see that Frank was experiencing genuine distress, so she spoke softly to him, explaining that he was safe and home in his own neighborhood while encouraging him to breathe slowly with her guidance. The officers observed this interaction with apparent confusion mixed with what seemed like slight embarrassment, with the second officer defensively stating that they were simply conducting a routine check based on a call they had received. Travis asked what kind of call they had received, maintaining a polite but firm tone, because Frank had stated that he lived in the building and was merely returning from a grocery store trip. The first officer replied that they didn't need civilians interfering with official police business, and Travis responded that this wasn't interference, but rather community concern, emphasizing that Frank was clearly experiencing a medical crisis and they needed to focus on helping him rather than continuing the interrogation. Frank's breathing began to stabilize, but he remained visibly shaken, and he quietly told Travis and Taylor that this same scenario happened every month, with officers stopping him, demanding identification, and forcing him to prove his right to belong in his own home, and each incident took him mentally back to the jungle of his military service. Taylor asked with anger evident in her voice whether this occurred every month, and Frank confirmed that sometimes the same two officers were involved and sometimes others, but the story remained consistent with reports of someone calling about suspicious activity and the need for identification verification. Travis asked the officers directly whether Frank was known to their department and if he had ever been arrested or charged with any crimes. And after the officers exchanged glances, the first one admitted that they weren't aware of any such incidents. Travis pressed further, questioning why they were repeatedly stopping and checking identification of a law-abiding citizen and military veteran based on what specific evidence or reasoning. The officers maintained that they respond to calls they receive, and Taylor asked who had called that day and what specifically had been reported as suspicious activity. The officers appeared clearly uncomfortable with these direct questions, claiming they couldn't reveal details about ongoing investigations. But Travis pointed out that this wasn't an investigation, but rather harassment that was triggering PTSD episodes in a Vietnam veteran. By this point, other residents had begun gathering around the commotion, and an elderly African-American woman approached the group, completely ignoring the police officers while asking Frank if he was okay. Frank replied that he was all right, though still obviously shaken, and Mrs. Patterson turned to the officers with a stern expression, demanding to know why they were bothering Frank again since this was the 4th time during the current year. The first officer began explaining that they were responding to calls, but Mrs. Patterson interrupted, asking what calls they meant since she had lived in the complex for 15 years and Frank was the most respectful and quiet neighbor they had, helping carry groceries for elderly residents, watching children when they played outside, and never causing any trouble. Additional residents joined the group and expressed similar positive sentiments about Frank, with a younger Hispanic man stating that Frank was a good person who had helped fix his car the previous month without accepting payment, and a young woman with a toddler added that Frank regularly brought soup to her grandmother when she was ill. Travis realized that Frank wasn't merely a resident of the apartment complex, but was actually a valued and respected member of the community, and the police harassment wasn't only affecting Frank, but was impacting everyone who cared about him. Travis addressed the officers again, pointing out that it seemed clear that Frank was not only a legitimate resident, but also a respected community member, so he had to ask again what the real reason was for Frank's repeated stops and questioning. The second officer's face reddened as he responded that they didn't have to justify their police work to celebrities, and if there was a problem with their job performance, a formal complaint could be filed. Taylor quietly but firmly stated that maybe they would indeed file such a complaint, and she asked Frank if he would be willing to share more details